Power, when it reaches its peak, doesn't crack. It shatters, and it does so in silence before the fall ever makes a sound. Carson Blake had never feared the spotlight. He thrived in it. Until the door opened, and the woman he'd once vowed to love entered with a rival titan on her arm. He was at the height of his power, his lover by his side, owning the spotlight, until the door opened and his wife walked in with a prominent CEO. The room froze. The once confident man found himself drifting in the weight of quiet stares and half-hidden smirks. The balance had shifted, though no one could yet define how. The crystal champagne flute exploded against the travertine tiles of the Malibu estate's great room, shards glinting like slivers of light across the gleaming floor. 50 heads turned toward Carson Blake, his hands still hovering where the glass had been. "Say that again," Carson whispered, the edge in his voice sharp as glass. Nathan Pierce, Carson's CFO and his most trusted confidant of 2 decades, adjusted his collar, visibly uneasy. The quiet buzz of conversation that had filled the estate only moments before had vanished, leaving only the soft strains of live bossa nova from the trio in the corner. "Maybe we should talk privately," Nathan murmured, casting a glance at the who's who of Southern California's finance scene, all pretending not to watch. "No." Carson's jaw tightened. "Repeat it, right here." The Blake Capital annual fundraiser had been meant to mark Carson's grand ascent, the night he would finally unveil the Horizon Tech acquisition and solidify his legend. Instead, standing poised in his Brioni tuxedo, Carson was staring down a nightmare. "The SEC's opened a file," Nathan said lowly. "They're investigating the Horizon Tech deal. Someone leaked something." Carson's cold gray eyes swept the room, catching every opulent centerpiece, the panoramic view of the Pacific glowing behind the glass walls, and the sideways glances of people who had come to celebrate him. At 52, Carson Blake had turned a 2-man garage operation into one of California's premier investment firms. This night was supposed to be his coronation. "Find Morgan," he said, adjusting his cufflinks with a steady hand that masked the turmoil within. As Nathan disappeared into the crowd, Carson composed himself. He crouched down and picked up a jagged shard of crystal. "Hazard of celebration," he quipped to the silent onlookers. "When you're about to announce the biggest deal of your career, things tend to crack." A polite ripple of laughter returned to the air. Conversations hesitantly resumed. A staffer approached with a broom, but Carson waved him off. "I handle my own messes," he said firmly, loud enough to carry. Across the room, Celeste Monroe leaned on the edge of the bar, her navy satin gown shimmering under the lights with every small motion. At 29, she was the newest executive on board at Blake Capital, and Carson's current distraction. Her dark curls were pinned neatly up, exposing her shoulder where his lips had lingered just last night. "Quite the party," said a rich voice beside her, though our host seems a bit distracted. Celeste turned to find Julian Cross, CEO of Crosswell Dynamics, standing with effortless poise in his tailored tux. He offered a glass-raising nod. Julian was one of the few men on the West Coast whose fortune could rival Carson's, though the way each had earned it couldn't have been more opposite. "Mr. Cross," Celeste smiled, extending her hand, "I didn't expect to see you tonight." "Carson and I may not always agree," Julian said, his slight Jamaican lilt softened after decades living in the U.S., "but we back the same causes. And I never turn down a chance to see how the other half celebrates." His eyes, warm and observant, lingered on her face before flicking over to Carson, who was now deep in conversation with the governor. "How long have you been with Blake Capital?" Julian asked. "Half a year," Celeste replied. "I head the marketing division." "And how long have you been sleeping with him?" Her smile wavered for just a heartbeat before returning, this time with a sharper edge. "You don't waste much time with small talk, do you?" "Life's too short," Julian shrugged. "Especially when you're dancing near flames." Before Celeste could respond, Nathan appeared at her side. "Carson needs you," he said, voice low and expression grave. Celeste excused herself and moved through the sea of guests following Nathan's lead. Julian watched her go, swirling the amber liquid in his glass thoughtfully. Then, slipping out his phone, he typed a short message. "She's here. You were right." Meanwhile, in a quiet, ivy-wrapped villa nestled in the hills of Santa Barbara, Lauren Blake sat alone in the dim living room, eyes fixed on her phone. A message from her sister glowed on the screen. "Are you sure about this?" There's no turning back now. Lauren, 42, had spent the last 15 years as Carson Blake's wife, a title that had gradually dissolved her identity until she barely recognized the woman reflected back at her. Once a spirited art history graduate from UCLA, she had become an elegant fixture in Carson's world, admired, displayed, and silent. But tonight, while Carson believed she was visiting her sister in Napa, Lauren was about to activate a plan months in the making. Her laptop held neatly labeled folders, evidence of Carson's affairs, his financial misconduct, the offshore accounts he assumed she'd never discover. And most crucially, she had the truth behind the Horizon Tech deal. Her phone rang, cutting through the quiet. The caller ID read, Camila Rivera, her assistant and the only person besides her sister who knew everything. "They're all there," Camila said without delay. Carson, Celeste, the governor, even Julian Cross made an appearance. "And the SEC?" Lauren asked, voice even. "They'll announce the investigation tomorrow morning. Your anonymous tip covered everything." Lauren closed her eyes briefly, recalling the moment 6 months earlier when she'd first found the message between Carson and Celeste. She had been looking for an earring in his study when she bumped his unlocked phone from the desk. The message that flashed on the screen left no room for interpretation. It wasn't Carson's first betrayal, but something in Lauren had shifted. She began watching. His long meetings, his frequent trips, the way he spoke about the gifted new marketing executive. And in tracing his infidelity, she uncovered something darker. "What about the documents?" Lauren asked. "They're ready," Camila replied. "We just need to send them to the right people." "I'm sure," Camila said with calm certainty. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Lauren? It will destroy him." Lauren glanced at the deep navy gown draped over the door of her closet, the one Carson had never seen, the one she'd bought specifically for this night. "He destroyed us a long time ago," she said. "He just hasn't realized it yet." Back at the fundraiser, Carson pulled Celeste into his private study, shutting the door behind them with a firm, final click. "What did you do?" he snapped, the calm mask he wore in public slipping away the moment they were alone. "What are you talking about?" Celeste recoiled, her back pressing against the paneled wall. "The SEC, Celeste. They're investigating the Horizon Tech deal. Someone handed them details only a handful of people could have accessed." Her eyes widened. "You think it was me? That's insane. I've stood by you through every phase of this deal." "Exactly," Carson said, stepping closer until he loomed over her. "You were at meetings you didn't belong in, reading documents you had no business touching." "Because you asked me to be there," Celeste's voice rose in defense. "You said you trusted me." Carson stared at her, scanning her expression for even the smallest fracture of deceit. He had brought Celeste on board 6 months earlier, despite her limited experience, pulled in by her sharpness, her ambition, and yes, by the way she looked at him like he hung the stars, something Lauren hadn't done in years. "If I find out you betrayed me," he said in a low, controlled voice, "there won't be a firm in the country that would let you near a reception desk." Celeste's features hardened. "You know what your real problem is, Carson? You're so busy waiting for betrayal, you don't recognize loyalty when it's standing in front of you." She brushed past him toward the door, then paused with her hand on the knob. "For the record," she added coldly, "maybe you should be asking yourself who else might have a reason to watch you fall." With that, she was gone. Carson turned toward the massive window, his eyes locked on the Pacific horizon. He had conquered the Horizon Tech deal. It was poised to double Blake Capital's value within weeks. He had wagered everything on it. His reputation, his firm's liquidity, long-term clients who trusted him without question. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. He opened it, and his blood ran cold. It was a photo of Lauren, not in Napa as she had claimed, in Los Angeles, walking into a restaurant with Julian Cross. The timestamp, 2 hours ago. Carson stared at the image, disbelief crashing into him. Lauren and Julian, they had never even met, or so he thought. But now the pieces started clicking into place with a brutal, undeniable logic. Lauren's perfectly timed getaway. The SEC's investigation, this anonymous photo, his wife, his biggest rival, together. His hand clenched so tightly around the phone that his knuckles turned pale. In 15 years of marriage, he had written Lauren off as the quiet, elegant partner who traded her independence for his shadow. And now he wasn't so sure who had underestimated whom. He had cheated on her, lied to her, and eventually stopped seeing her altogether. Now it seemed she was making sure he'd never forget her again. The door creaked open, and Nathan stepped inside. The sharp contrast of the ambient jazz and Nathan's pale expression struck Carson like a warning shot. "Carson, they're waiting for your speech." Carson smoothed the front of his jacket, his thoughts spinning with calculations and possible exits. "Tell them I'll be right there." "What are we going to do about the SEC?" Nathan asked, his usual composure visibly shaken. Carson's smile was cool as he slipped his phone into his pocket. "First, we raise a glass to our success." He paused. "Then we announce the Horizon Tech acquisition, just as planned. The investigation," he straightened his sleeves with the precision of a man shielding panic behind polish, "we'll handle. One crisis at a time, Nathan. Right now we have a room full of people to entertain." As Carson stepped back into the grand atrium, champagne flute in hand, the crowd greeted him with applause. The warmth of the welcome barely touched him. It felt distant, hollow, like praise echoing down a tunnel he no longer controlled. He took his place at the podium, the epitome of power and composure. No one could have guessed his empire was beginning to fracture beneath the surface. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice steady and resonant, "thank you for joining us for this extraordinary evening." The elevator doors at the rear of the space slid open with a whisper. "Tonight isn't only about celebrating what Blake Capital has accomplished, but about envisioning where we're going." As someone moved through the gathering toward the front, the crowd subtly parted. "A future that begins with our acquisition of Horizon Tech, which I'm proud to." His words froze. Lauren was walking toward him, draped in that deep navy gown, her gaze fixed firmly on his. The room seemed to contract, the lights too bright, the silence too sharp. And behind her, watching with quiet satisfaction, stood Julian Cross. The champagne glass in Carson's hand trembled just slightly as Lauren stopped a few feet away, calm and poised. Her smile was elegant and quietly devastating. "Hello, darling," she said, her voice cutting through the sudden stillness. "I hope I'm not too late for your big announcement." The applause faded into a breathless hush. A single heartbeat seemed to echo between them. Carson's grip tightened on the podium, his eyes bouncing between Lauren and Julian, calculating with the focus of a man realizing his queen was suddenly in play. "Lauren," he said smoothly, his public mask snapping back into place. "What a surprise. I thought you were in Napa." "Plans change," she said, with just enough warmth to sound believable. "I couldn't miss your special night." The crowd collectively relaxed, accepting the exchange as a sweet gesture of marital support. Only a few, Nathan standing tensely to one side, Celeste by the bar with narrowed eyes, sensed the tension rippling beneath the surface. "Ladies and gentlemen," Carson continued, never once breaking eye contact with Lauren, "it seems we have even more to celebrate tonight. Please help me welcome my wife, Lauren, who made a special trip to be here with us." Polite applause swept through the room. Lauren dipped her head graciously, while Julian remained just behind her, his expression giving away nothing. "And of course, Julian Cross of Crosswell Dynamics," Carson added, his tone betraying none of the fury simmering beneath the surface. "An unexpected addition to our guest list." Julian stepped forward with an affable nod. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I bumped into Lauren earlier this evening and offered to escort her." Before Carson could respond, a tall woman with silver-streaked black hair approached Lauren and enveloped her in a warm embrace. "Lauren, darling, no one mentioned you'd be here tonight." "Diana," Lauren smiled, returning the hug. It was a last-minute decision. Diana Hamid, the 65-year-old matriarch of Horizon Tech and one of California's most influential figures in finance, turned toward Carson with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Carson, you must be delighted to have your wife here for this announcement. Family support is so important during these kinds of transitions." The pause she placed on that last word wasn't lost on him. Diana had been hesitant about selling the company from the start, but the board had overruled her. Now she stood beside his wife, both women watching him with nearly identical expressions. "There's nothing more important than family," Carson said, raising his glass. Which brings me back to the announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, Blake Capital is proud to announce our acquisition of Horizon Tech, uniting two of California's most trusted financial institutions. Camera flashes lit the room as reporters documented the milestone. Carson launched into his scripted speech, outlining the merger's projected impact, all while carefully avoiding any glance in the direction of Lauren or Julian. When he concluded, the crowd erupted in applause. Guests returned to their conversations, champagne glasses refilling. As Carson stepped away from the podium, Diana approached. "Impressive speech," she said in a low voice. "Almost convinced me you cared about my father's legacy, and not just the assets you're stripping." Carson's smile didn't falter. "This deal benefits everyone, Diana. Your shareholders cash out, your employees stay, and your father's name will live on, as part of something larger." "Yes, I've heard your version," Diana said, her gray eyes hardening. "But I've also heard whispers about how certain regulatory approvals were secured, about offshore account activity just before the company valuation." Carson didn't flinch, but a muscle along his jaw jumped. "Be careful, Diana. Unfounded accusations can lead to very unpleasant legal consequences." "Accusations?" she replied smoothly. "Oh, Carson, I've accused no one, just sharing notes between colleagues, though I wonder, does your wife share similar insights?" Before he could answer, she drifted away toward Lauren and Julian, now deep in conversation with several investors. The three of them appeared entirely at ease. Too at ease for people who had supposedly only just met. "You're going to want to see this," Nathan muttered suddenly at Carson's side. He handed Carson a tablet discreetly. On the screen was an email from the SEC's Enforcement Division addressed to Blake Capital's board, announcing a freeze on all transactions related to the Horizon Tech acquisition pending further investigation. The timestamp read, 30 minutes ago. "Who else has seen this?" Carson asked, his voice barely above a whisper, cold and lethal. "Just me so far." "It hit the board's secure inbox," Nathan murmured. "Keep it that way," Carson replied. He handed the tablet back. "Hold off on any official reply until morning. I need time to get ahead of this." Nathan hesitated. "Carson, if the SEC is formally involved." "Just do it." Carson cut him off sharply. "Trust me." As Nathan walked away, visibly uneasy, Carson felt someone step beside him. Celeste had appeared, a fresh glass of champagne in hand. "Trouble in paradise?" she asked quietly, nodding toward Lauren. "I thought she was conveniently out of town." "Not now, Celeste?" "Yes, now." She moved closer, her voice low but firm. "You accuse me of betraying you, and yet your wife arrives hand in hand with your biggest rival the same night the SEC launches an investigation. Even you can add that up." Carson turned to her fully. Celeste was driven, strategic, qualities he'd once praised and taken advantage of. But she was also smart enough to be a threat. "What do you know about the SEC inquiry?" he asked directly. Her expression flickered. Surprise, maybe, but only briefly. "Only what Nathan mentioned, that they're looking into the Horizon Tech deal. But seeing Lauren with Cross makes me wonder who's pulling strings here." Carson studied her face, searching for any sign of deceit. "If you're lying, I'm not the one you should be worried about," she cut in. Her gaze drifted toward Lauren. "While you've been treating your wife like window dressing, she's been aligning herself with Diana Hamid and Julian Cross. That's not random, Carson. That's strategy." Across the room, Camila Rivera watched the exchange unfold. As Lauren's assistant for the last 5 years, Camila had honed an uncanny knack for reading a room. And now, she could see Carson's once solid facade beginning to crack. She caught Lauren's eye and offered the subtlest of nods. Everything was moving according to plan. Lauren politely excused herself from her conversation with Diana and Julian and began making her way to the bar. Right on cue, Carson intercepted her. "What the hell are you doing?" he whispered through clenched teeth, his smile frozen in place for the benefit of watching guests. "Having a drink at my husband's gala," Lauren answered evenly, signaling to the bartender. "Gin and tonic, please." "You know what I mean," Carson hissed. "You were supposed to be in Napa? Now you show up here? With Julian Cross?" She accepted her drink, taking a slow sip before replying. "Plans change, Carson. Isn't that your mantra? Adapt or die?" "How do you even know Cross?" he asked. "The West Coast art scene isn't that vast," she said. "Julian's a major donor to the Institute. We met at a fundraiser last month. Turns out we have a lot in common. The ambiguity lingered in the air like smoke. Carson's eyes narrowed. Whatever you think this is, it won't work. You don't have it in you. Lauren's smile softened, almost mournful. That's always been your flaw, Carson. You've never really seen me. Before he could reply, she placed a gentle hand on his arm, a gesture that looked affectionate to the untrained eye. Oh, and congratulations on the Horizon Tech acquisition, she said, her voice as light as champagne. Such perfect timing. She walked away, leaving Carson momentarily speechless. The message was clear. She knew about the SEC investigation. Not far off, a distinguished gentleman in his 70s observed the exchange with quiet interest. Judge Harrison Montgomery had known Carson since the early days of his career, once serving as an initial investor in Blake Capital. He had also known Lauren's father, and watched, with growing disappointment, as the vibrant young woman faded into her husband's shadow. "Trouble at home, Carson?" the judge asked as Carson approached him. "Nothing serious, Harrison. Just surprised to see Lauren here tonight." The judge's skeptical expression suggested otherwise. Surprised is one word. Concerned might be a better one, given the company she's been keeping. Carson accepted a new glass of champagne from a passing server. "Julian's harmless. He's just playing the social game." "Is that what you think?" Judge Montgomery's eyebrows lifted. "Son, I've watched you build this empire for 15 years, and I've admired your tenacity. But you've always had a blind spot where it matters most." Meaning, while you've been busy taking over California's financial scene, you haven't noticed what's been unraveling at home. The judge leaned in slightly. "Did you know your wife's been meeting regularly with Diana Hamid for the past 3 months? Or that she's been in contact with the SEC's new enforcement director?" Carson's face flickered for a brief moment. "How do you know this?" "California's smaller than you think when you've lived here long enough," the judge replied calmly. "People talk. And lately, they've been talking about Lauren Blake stepping out of your shadow." Across the room, Julian Cross politely disengaged from a conversation and stepped onto the terrace. Once alone, he made a call. "It's unfolding exactly as you said it would," he said quietly. Carson's completely caught off guard. "And Lauren?" asked the voice on the other end. "Playing it perfectly. You'd never guess she's been laying the groundwork for months." "What about the SEC?" "Notice delivered. The board will see it by morning, but Carson's already trying to contain it." "Good," the voice replied. "And the documents?" Julian looked back through the glass, eyes landing on Lauren amid the crowd. "She has them. All of them." "Perfect. By this time tomorrow, Carson Blake will be watching his empire crumble." There was a pause, then Julian asked, voice tinged with hesitation. "You're sure about this? Once we cross this line?" "He crossed it first," the voice snapped. 15 years ago when he stole everything and left me with nothing. This isn't revenge, Julian. This is justice." As Julian ended the call, he remained unaware that Celeste had been standing silently at the far end of the terrace, having heard every word. Inside, Carson had pulled Nathan into a secluded corner, his restraint fraying. "I need to know exactly what we're dealing with," he said, voice taut. "How bad is it?" Nathan's face was grim. "Bad, Carson. They've got documentation, offshore transfers, manipulated valuations, even the closed-door meetings with Commissioner Taylor." "That's impossible," Carson hissed. "Those meetings were completely off the record. The only people who knew were you, me, and—" He stopped. Suddenly, Carson's gaze locked on Lauren across the room. She was mid-conversation with the governor, but as if she sensed his stare, she looked up. Their eyes met. And for the first time, Carson saw something in her expression he had never noticed before. Triumph. "Jesus," Carson muttered under his breath. "It's her. She's the one gathering evidence." "What?" Nathan asked, genuinely confused. "Lauren? That's insane. She doesn't know anything about our operations. Doesn't she?" Carson's mind raced back over the past few months, nights he'd worked from home, confidential files left out in his study, phone calls he'd made assuming she was immersed in her book or tablet. "She's been inside our home, my office. She has access to my devices, my schedule, my contacts." "But why?" Nathan asked before trailing off. His eyes followed a movement across the room where Celeste had just rejoined the crowd. "Ah," he said softly. Carson followed his gaze, then shook his head. "No, it's not that. Lauren has always looked the other way." "Has she?" Nathan replied, just as quietly. Or has she been watching and waiting all this time? Before Carson could respond, a sudden shift near the entrance pulled everyone's attention. Two men in dark suits entered, scanning the room with silent intent. "Federal agents," Nathan whispered. "SEC Enforcement Division." Carson's pulse thundered, but he kept his expression neutral. "Stay calm. They can't do anything without formal charges." "Mr. Blake," one of the agents approached, holding up his badge. "I'm Agent Daniels with the Securities and Exchange Commission. We need to speak with you regarding transactions linked to Horizon Tech." The room hushed once more. Every eye turned toward Carson. And in the middle of that storm, Carson did what he'd always done best. He projected control. "Of course, Agent Daniels," he said, his voice ringing with calm authority. "Blake Capital is always cooperative with regulatory inquiries." He raised his voice slightly, letting it carry. "However, as you can see, we're hosting a formal event. Perhaps we could arrange a time, say, first thing tomorrow morning?" The agent paused, clearly not expecting such poised resistance. "This is a time-sensitive matter, Mr. Blake." "I understand," Carson said smoothly, "but unless you have a warrant, I must insist we follow proper procedure. My legal team will be available at 8 a.m. sharp." As the agent stepped aside to confer, Carson noticed Lauren watching him, her face unreadable. Beside her, Diana Hammond stood with a faint smile that said she was enjoying every second. Then Carson's phone buzzed. A message. "Unknown number. Check your private email immediately. You have 5 minutes to accept the terms or everything goes public." Excusing himself with practiced grace, Carson retreated to his private office. The agents remained in quiet discussion. Hands steady, he unlocked his secure laptop and accessed his private email, an account not linked to Blake Capital. There it was, an encrypted message. "Final notice, settlement terms." He opened the attachment, and as his eyes scanned the contents, the color drained from his face. He gripped the edge of his desk, the sheer weight of what he read nearly buckling his knees. It contained everything, undeniable proof of every corner cut, every valuation tweaked, every ethical line crossed in the creation of Blake Capital. The offshore accounts, the manipulated numbers, the payments to Commissioner Taylor disguised as consulting fees. But worst of all, embedded in the file, was an audio recording. Carson's own voice, discussing how to artificially inflate Horizon Tech's debt in order to drive down the acquisition cost. "You're done." The voice came from the doorway. Carson spun around to see Judge Harrison Montgomery standing there, his elderly frame now carrying a gravity Carson had never before noticed. "Harrison," Carson said quickly, minimizing the email, "this isn't a great time." "On the contrary," the judge said, stepping in and closing the door behind him. "It's exactly the right time, before you make another mistake." Carson's thoughts spun. Exit plans, backup options, anything. "Whatever you think you know, I know everything," Montgomery interrupted, voice steady, nearly gentle. "Just like Lauren does. Just like the SEC will by morning. Unless you agree to the terms in that email." The words landed like a punch. "You're part of this?" "I've been part of this from the start," Montgomery said, settling into the leather chair across from Carson's desk. 15 years ago, I watched you take Richard Blake's firm while he was dying of cancer. I watched you marry his daughter and slowly erase her from her own legacy." Carson's jaw flexed. "Richard was reckless. He was going to destroy everything. I saved that company." "No, you dismantled it and rebuilt it in your image," Montgomery replied. "And in doing so, you broke securities laws, committed fraud, and betrayed the man who mentored you." "And now what?" Carson's voice was low and dangerous. "Lauren and her little alliance blackmail me? Take my company, my wealth?" Montgomery looked at him with something that resembled pity. "Even now, that's all you see. Assets, power, control. Read the terms, Carson. You have 3 minutes." Carson turned back to the screen, his eyes scanning. The terms were clear, even elegant in their simplicity. He would resign as CEO of Blake Capital, citing health reasons. He would give up all voting rights to his shares, placing them in a blind trust. He would keep his personal fortune, but have no further role in the company's direction. The Horizon Tech deal would go forward, but under revised terms that preserved the staff and legacy of the original firm. In exchange, every shred of evidence against him would stay buried. "This is extortion," Carson said flatly. "No," Montgomery replied. "This is mercy, more than you deserve." Carson's phone buzzed. Nathan. He ignored it, his mind rapidly sorting through options, calculating outcomes, the way he always did when the stakes were highest. "And if I refuse?" he asked finally. "Then by 9 a.m., every file will be in the SEC's hands," Montgomery said calmly. "By noon, you'll be indicted. By nightfall, everything you've built will be gone." Montgomery checked his watch. 1 minute. Outside, the gala pulsed on, California's elite mingling effortlessly, oblivious to the collapse happening behind the glass walls of Carson's office. Through those very panes, he could see Lauren talking animatedly with Julian Cross, her face alight in a way he hadn't seen in years. It wasn't just that she was smiling, it was how easily she did it, how utterly distant she seemed from the version of herself that used to orbit his world. Something twisted deep inside him, not just anger, not fear, but something more haunting, an ache of unfamiliarity. When had she become a stranger? When had he stopped seeing her as anything more than an accessory to his image? 30 seconds, Montgomery said softly. Carson turned back to the screen, the cursor hovering over the accept terms button. His whole identity, his purpose, was wrapped in Blake capital. Without it, who was he? As the seconds slipped away, a memory flickered. Lauren on their wedding day, her eyes filled with hope, her voice barely a whisper. "Promise me you'll remember what matters." He had broken that promise a long time ago. "Time's up, Carson." The words hit like a verdict. With a final breath, Carson clicked accept. A confirmation message blinked onto the screen. Agreement recorded. Details to follow. Montgomery gave a single nod. Not approval, just acknowledgement. "You made the right choice." "Did I have one?" Carson asked, his voice dry. "We always have choices," the judge replied, rising from his chair. "You made yours years ago, when you decided success justified anything." As Montgomery reached for the door, Carson called out, "Did she ever love me, or was I just a way to save her father's company?" The old man paused, hand resting on the knob. "Lauren loved you completely, that was her flaw. She gave everything to someone who never learned how to hold it without breaking it. That's what made her blind to who you really were. Until she wasn't." Then the door closed, leaving Carson in the hollow silence of realization. He had lost far more than a company. When Carson finally stepped back into the gala, the party had hit its golden peak. Laughter loud, champagne endless, music swelling. It all felt like a dream being played out in reverse. He was no longer the host, but the ghost. He moved among the crowd on autopilot, exchanging smiles, accepting congratulations on the Horizon Tech merger. No one realized they were witnessing the final moments of his reign. Nathan intercepted him by the bar. "Where the hell have you been?" The SEC agents left, but they scheduled a formal interview for tomorrow morning. "Cancel it," Carson said, voice flat. "Then call an emergency board meeting for 8 a.m. Nathan blinked. "What are you talking about?" "I'm stepping down as CEO, effective immediately." "You're what?" Nathan hissed, pulling Carson into a quieter corner. "Have you lost your damn mind?" Carson gave a short, bitter laugh. "On the contrary, I think I finally found it, buried under layers of ambition and denial." He nodded toward the dance floor. Lauren was dancing with Julian, radiant and unburdened. "I underestimated her," Carson said. "We all did." Nathan followed his gaze, his expression shifting from confusion to something closer to understanding. "She's behind it, the SEC, the whole thing. Lauren, Montgomery, probably Diana Hamid too." Carson took a long breath. "They've had months, plenty of time to collect evidence, build a case. I was so obsessed with the deal, I never saw it coming." "So what now? You're just giving up?" Nathan asked, incredulous. "That's not like you." "It's not giving up," Carson replied, and was surprised at how steady he felt. "It's knowing when you've been outplayed." As Nathan absorbed those words, Celeste appeared at Carson's side, her cheeks flushed from dancing. "You know," Celeste said, voice casual but sharp, "everyone's wondering why you're lurking in corners instead of celebrating." Carson studied her, truly looked at her for the first time. The calculated gleam in her eyes, the poised confidence with which she had inserted herself into his world. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. Celeste's smile wavered. "Known what?" "About Lauren's plan. About Montgomery's involvement." She kept her expression neutral, but Carson noticed the subtle tightening in her shoulders. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," he said, stepping closer, his voice low. I think that's why you've been downloading confidential files this past month, just in case. Surprise flickered across her face, brief but unmistakable. Your IT security's better than I expected. Not really, Carson said coldly, but I do read the access logs, especially when sensitive documents are involved. He held her gaze. The only question is, are you with Lauren, or just running your own game? For a moment, Celeste's polished exterior cracked, revealing the sharp mind beneath. Smart men diversify their assets, she murmured. Smart women do the same with their loyalties. Before Carson could reply, a distinct chime of silverware against crystal drew the room's attention. Diana Hamid stood at the stage, statuesque in midnight blue, her silver hair glowing under the chandeliers. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice commanding the room, I'd like to share a few words about tonight's announcement. Carson felt a slow, creeping chill. This wasn't planned. As many of you know, Horizon Tech was founded by my father 60 years ago on a principle that remains as vital today as it was then: integrity above all. Her eyes swept the room and lingered on Carson. Throughout these negotiations with Blake Capital, I've insisted that this principle remain the heart of our merged enterprise. Polite murmurs echoed across the room. That's why I'm thrilled to announce that, as part of this transition, we are establishing the Horizon Blake Ethics Foundation, a new body dedicated to promoting transparency and accountability in the financial sector. Diana raised her glass with a poised smile, and I can think of no one better to lead this effort than Lauren Blake, whose unwavering commitment to these values has been inspiring. Applause erupted as Lauren ascended the stage, her expression graceful and composed as she accepted the recognition. Carson stood frozen, watching the woman he had long dismissed as ornamental now crowned the moral figurehead of his firm's future. And, Diana continued once the applause settled, given the expanded scope of our combined operations, the board has unanimously agreed that new leadership is needed for this next chapter. The room quieted instantly. Eyes turned, first to Diana, then to Carson. Effective tomorrow morning, Carson Blake will assume an advisory role. Day-to-day leadership will transition to a committee led by Judge Harrison Montgomery. The words landed like a thunderclap in the marble-lined hall. Carson felt the weight of dozens of gazes on him, each one waiting for him to break. With immense effort, Carson kept his composure, even managing a slight nod of acknowledgement. This public dismantling had not been part of the agreement he'd accepted. Across the room, Lauren's eyes met his. There was no victory in her gaze, no malice, just a profound sadness, one that cut far deeper than triumph ever could. As Diana concluded her speech, Carson quietly slipped away, weaving through the guests and heading for the private elevator. He needed air, space, a break from the crushing weight of his collapsing empire. The elevator doors opened. Julian Cross was already inside. "Going somewhere?" Julian asked, tone neutral. "Just some air," Carson replied tightly. "I assume you're enjoying the performance." "I take no pleasure in another man's fall," Julian said, stepping aside so Carson could enter, "even when it's earned." As the doors closed, locking them into the confined space, Julian turned to face him. "She didn't want this to happen publicly, you know." "Spare me," Carson snapped. "Lauren engineered this whole takedown with military precision." "She did," Julian agreed. "But the announcement tonight? That was Diana's decision, not hers." The elevator climbed silently toward the rooftop garden. "Why are you telling me this?" Carson asked finally. "Because," Julian said, "despite everything, she still cares what happens to you." Carson gave a bitter laugh. "She has a funny way of showing it." "Does she?" Julian countered. "She could have handed the evidence straight to the feds. Instead, she structured a way for you to leave with your freedom and your fortune." The doors slid open onto the rooftop. The Los Angeles skyline glittered under the night sky, cold and distant. Carson stepped out, his mind whirling. "There's one more thing you should know," Julian said, remaining inside. "Something about Celeste." Carson turned. "What about her?" "She's not who you think she is." Julian held the door with one hand. "Her real name is Celeste Blake, Richard's niece, your cousin by marriage." Carson staggered. "That's not possible. Richard didn't have any siblings." "Half-sister," Julian corrected, "from his father's first marriage. The connection was hidden, deliberately, when you hired her." As the doors began to close, Julian added one last thing. You might want to look into which files she's accessed, especially the ones tied to Richard's original ownership stake. The doors shut with finality, and Carson stood alone on the rooftop, the Pacific wind slicing around him, his kingdom crumbling piece by piece. With shaking hands, he pulled out his phone, finally understanding the full scope of the trap he'd walked into. It wasn't just Lauren and her allies he had to worry about. It was the enemy he had unknowingly invited into his most private circle. The message on Carson's screen confirmed what he'd feared most. Original Blake shares transferring to rightful family line. Poetic justice. Don't you think, cousin? 3 days after the gala, Carson sat alone in his home office, surrounded by the remnants of a success that had evaporated overnight. The room was pristine but sterile, like a museum exhibit dedicated to a life that no longer existed. Newspapers lay strewn across his desk, headlines screaming in bold, merciless type. Blake steps down amid regulatory storm. West Coast Titan falls. Hamid Blake merger proceeds under new leadership. The financial press had been blunt but accurate. The society columns were even crueler, gleefully recounting his downfall with terms like spectacular implosion and long overdue reckoning. One particularly brutal piece speculated about Lauren's growing closeness with Julian Cross, hinting their relationship had deepened, while Carson was distracted with his young marketing hire. He stared at the photo that accompanied the article. Lauren in a quiet moment, laughing at something Julian had said. There was a softness to her face that gutted him. Not because she'd found someone else, but because she looked like herself again. He hadn't seen or spoken to Lauren since the night of the gala. She hadn't returned to their beachfront home, and every call went to voicemail. His lawyer told him she was staying with her sister and had requested space while they worked through the separation terms. The doorbell rang, pulling him from the spiral of thoughts. He ignored it, just like he'd ignored texts from former colleagues and so-called friends. Then came the sound of a key in the lock. Nathan Pierce appeared in the doorway, hesitant but resolved. "You look like hell," Nathan observed, taking in Carson's unshaven face and wrinkled clothes. "I wasn't expecting company," Carson replied coldly. "How'd you get in?" "Lauren gave me her key. She's worried about you." Carson let out a bitter laugh. "That's rich, coming from the person who helped engineer my destruction." Nathan pulled up a chair and sat across from him. "Is that really what you think? That Lauren did this to destroy you?" "What would you call it?" "Self-preservation," Nathan said simply. "She saw what was coming, what you refused to see. She protected herself and you, whether you believe that or not." Carson's temper flared. "Protected me? By tearing down my company? By humiliating me in front of everyone who matters in this city? By keeping you out of prison," Nathan countered. "The SEC has enough to put you away for 10 years. The deal Lauren arranged lets you walk away, free and still very wealthy." That line hit like a slap. Carson had been so consumed by the public shame, he hadn't considered the alternative she'd saved him from. Carson said nothing, but the weight of Nathan's words began to settle. "Why are you here?" he finally asked. "Because someone has to pull you out of this nosedive before you make it worse," Nathan said firmly. "The board meeting's tomorrow. You need to be there, clean, composed, ready to formally resign and endorse the transition plan. And if I don't?" "Then the backup plan activates," Nathan said, his voice grim. "All evidence goes to the authorities, and the company will publicly disavow you to survive." Carson stood suddenly, pacing toward the window that overlooked the Pacific. The water that had once symbolized luxury and power now looked vast and merciless. "You knew, didn't you? About Lauren's plan, about Celeste." Nathan was silent for a long time. "I suspected Lauren knew more than she let on. As for Celeste, I had concerns about her from the beginning, but you wouldn't hear it." "Why didn't you warn me?" "I tried, Carson. For years, I tried to warn you about the corners you were cutting, about the enemies you were making. You didn't want to hear it." The truth of Nathan's words hung in the air between them. Carson had dismissed his longtime partner's warnings as cautionary noise, conservatism that got in the way of the aggressive expansion he'd envisioned. "What about Montgomery?" Carson asked. "Was he working against me all along?" "Harold was Richard's best friend," Nathan replied. "He watched you take over Richard's firm and systematically erase his legacy. Then he watched you do the same to Richard's daughter. He paused. I think he's been waiting for this moment for 15 years. Carson sat with the weight of that revelation. He thought back to how Montgomery had been one of his earliest supporters, always backing key deals, always present at pivotal moments. The perfect insider. And Celeste? He asked finally. Have they found her? Nathan shook his head. She vanished. Took a substantial number of confidential files with her. IT is still trying to determine how much damage was done. Carson turned to face the man who had once been his closest ally. You should have been on my side, Nathan, after everything we built. I was always on your side, Nathan said quietly. But somewhere along the way, you started mistaking loyalty for complicity. The words struck deeper than Carson expected. He lowered himself into his chair, the fight draining from him. What happens now? Now? Nathan stood. Now you start over. You're 52, not dead. You still have your wealth, your network, your mind. This doesn't have to be the end, unless you make it one. When Nathan left, Carson sat unmoving as the day slipped into night over the Pacific. For the first time in decades, he had no deals to close, no meetings, no battles to win. The silence was staggering. On impulse, he reached into his desk and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal, Richard Blake's diary. Carson had kept it after his death, never bothering to read it. Just a memento from a man he'd written off as obsolete. Now he opened it, flipping to a random entry from 15 years ago. Carson shows remarkable talent for seeing opportunity where others see risk. In that way, he reminds me of myself. But I worry about his impatience. His belief that the ends justify any means. I've tried to show him that real success doesn't leave casualties, but I fear he mistakes my ethics for weakness. Perhaps Lauren can reach him. She sees the best in people, even when they don't see it in themselves. Carson closed the journal slowly, a tightness forming in his chest. Richard had seen him clearly. All of him. The brilliance, the flaws. Even then. The next morning, Carson walked into Blake Capital, soon to be Horizon Blake Financial, immaculately dressed in a custom suit, clean-shaven, every inch the professional. The receptionist blinked in surprise as he crossed the lobby but recovered quickly. Mr. Blake, good morning. The board is assembled in the main conference room. Thank you, Sophia. He paused. For what it's worth. I always appreciated your professionalism. She blinked again, not expecting warmth from a man known for precision, not kindness. Thank you, sir. As Carson walked the familiar hallway toward the boardroom, conversations fell silent mid-sentence. Employees turned to look. Some glanced away awkwardly. Others met his gaze with open curiosity, or, in a few cases, the quiet satisfaction of watching a giant fall. Outside the boardroom, Camila Rivera, Lauren's assistant, stood waiting with a folder in hand. Mr. Blake, she greeted with professional calm. Mrs. Blake asked me to give you these ahead of the meeting, for your reference. Carson accepted the folder, immediately recognizing the contents, formal resignation paperwork and transition documents. Is she here? No, sir, Camila replied. She thought her presence might complicate things. Carson nodded. He wasn't surprised, but somehow still disappointed. You've been loyal to her a long time. She's easy to be loyal to, Camila said simply. Inside the boardroom, silence fell as Carson entered. Around the polished table sat the directors of Blake Capital, men and women who mere days ago had followed his lead without question. Now their expressions ranged from pity to restrained contempt. At the head of the table, in Carson's usual seat, sat Judge Harrison Montgomery. Diana Hamid sat beside him, composed and elegant. Nathan Pierce nodded faintly from halfway down the table. Thank you for joining us, Carson, Montgomery began, tone formal. As you know, we're here to finalize the leadership transition and approve the revised Horizon Tech acquisition terms. Carson took the only empty seat, directly across from Montgomery. Before we begin, Carson said, I'd like to say a few words. Montgomery glanced at Diana, then gave a short nod. Go ahead. Carson looked around the table, meeting every eye. I built this company from scratch. Every decision, good or bad, ethical or otherwise, was made in service of building Blake Capital into an industry leader. He paused, and a few expressions shifted, surprised by the absence of defensiveness. I also made mistakes, big ones. I bent rules, crossed lines, and in the end, I betrayed the values that should have grounded us. For that, I apologize. The silence deepened. No one quite knew how to respond. I've reviewed the transition plan, Carson continued, tapping the folder. It's fair, more than fair. Given the circumstances, I'll sign the resignation, and I'll support Judge Montgomery as interim chairman. Montgomery's brows lifted slightly. That's unexpected, Carson. Thank you. With one condition, Carson added. Diana leaned forward, her tone cool. You're hardly in a position to make demands, Mr. Blake. It's not a demand, just a request. He turned to her, voice steady. The Ethics Foundation you announced, I want to contribute. Not just financially, I want to give my time, my experience. A ripple of quiet shock moved around the table. Why? Diana asked, warily. Carson's answer was clear. Because I spent 15 years teaching this industry how to twist the rules for profit. Maybe I can spend the next 15 proving there's another way. Around the table, skeptical looks passed from one director to the next. A convenient conversion, some thought. One board member remarked, perhaps. Carson nodded. Sometimes clarity only comes after you lose everything you thought mattered. After the meeting, he found himself alone in his former office, packing up the few personal items he wanted to keep. Most of the mementos, the deal trophies, the glossy awards, the photos with politicians and celebrities, now felt like hollow relics of a version of himself he no longer recognized. A knock at the door broke the silence. Diana Hamid entered without waiting. That was quite the performance, she said, studying him. Not a performance, Carson replied, gently placing Richard's leather-bound journal into his briefcase. A realization. Diana slowly circled the office, her fingers trailing along the edge of the desk. My father used to say, there are two types of people in finance, those who use it to build something that matters, and those who treat it like a game to be won. He believed you were the former. I convinced him he was wrong, Carson said, closing the briefcase. Your father was wiser than I gave him credit for. I should have listened. And now? Diana challenged. Am I supposed to believe losing your company has suddenly made you the man my father always thought you could be? No, Carson said softly, but it's forced me to see who I've become. What I do next is up to me. Diana studied him in silence for a moment. Lauren never wanted to destroy you, you know. She just wanted to salvage what could still be saved of the company, and maybe of you. I know that now, Carson admitted. Too late, probably. That depends, Diana said cryptically. On what? On whether you're truly capable of change, or just adapting strategy to new conditions. She turned to go, then paused at the door. By the way, your offer to join the Ethics Foundation has been accepted. You start next month as an unpaid advisor. You'll report directly to Lauren. Carson froze. She agreed to that? It was her idea, Diana said, offering a rare smile. Maybe she still believes there's something left in you worth saving. After she left, Carson sat heavily in what was no longer his chair, the weight of everything settling around him. Lauren, his wife, the woman he had ignored, dismissed, betrayed, would now be his superior. The irony was almost poetic. His phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. Celeste Blake spotted boarding flight to Cayman Islands, tracking digital footprint. Will advise, JC. Julian Cross, still watching, still quietly steering the pieces. Before Carson could process that, another message arrived. Roof Terrace, 20 minutes, come alone, L. Carson read the text again, heart pounding. Lauren. After days of silence, she was finally willing to meet. He didn't know whether to expect reconciliation or the final cut. The rooftop terrace where they had celebrated their engagement 16 years ago was empty when he arrived. The Los Angeles skyline stretched before him, glittering with the illusion of permanence. Power, wealth, legacy, all of it had once defined him. Now he waited in silence, wondering what might come next. I wasn't sure you'd come, said Lauren's voice behind him. Carson turned to find his wife standing by the elevator, dressed in a simple blue gown that mirrored the color of her eyes. She looked familiar, and yet transformed, like someone reborn from betrayal, wielding her silence like armor. I would have understood if you never wanted to see me again, Carson said honestly. Part of me didn't, Lauren admitted, walking to stand beside him at the railing. But we have unfinished business. The divorce, Carson said, his throat tightening. No, Lauren replied, catching him off guard. Celeste Blake. She handed him a tablet. On the screen, a complex web of transactions appeared. Money funneled through shell companies, offshore accounts, digital currencies. She's not just after revenge, Lauren said. She's been systematically draining your personal holdings, everything not covered by the settlement. Carson studied the data, his instincts kicking in. The scale, the patterns, it was precise, calculated. This wasn't some bitter ex's retaliation. This was a hostile takeover of his life. This is professional. Because she's not working alone, Lauren said grimly. We believe she's partnered with James Canwell. The name struck Carson like a punch. James Canwell, Richard Blake's former business partner, who had left Blake Capital before Carson joined. The man Carson had discredited and forced into bankruptcy during his rise to power. That was 15 years ago, Carson said. He vanished after the SEC inquiry. He vanished from public view, Lauren corrected. Not from the industry. He's been operating through layers of intermediaries, building a network focused on corporate sabotage. Celeste is just his newest weapon. Carson's mind reeled, connecting pieces he should have seen earlier. The SEC probe into Blake Capital, that was Canwell too? No, Lauren said. That was me. I tipped them off. But he saw the chaos as a chance to activate Celeste. She paused, then added, This isn't just about us anymore. If Canwell succeeds, he won't just take you down. He could destabilize everything we've just rebuilt. Why are you telling me this? Carson asked, genuinely confused. You won. I signed it all over. Why risk anything for me now? Lauren met his eyes, steady and sincere. Because for better or worse, I meant my vows. Not just to you, but to what we tried to build. And because this isn't just about you, it's about protecting something bigger than either of us. She extended her hand. An offer, not for reconciliation, but for purpose, for redemption. Not to rewrite the past, but to prove the future can still mean something. Not through apologies, but through action. Will you help us stop them? Carson took her hand. Not as a husband, not as a CEO, but as a man signing a new kind of agreement, one built not on dominance or control, but mutual cause. Yes, he said simply. Together, they stood on the rooftop, the city sprawling beneath them. Carson had lost his company, his reputation, maybe even his marriage. But in that moment of utter collapse, he found something else. The opportunity to become the man Richard Blake had once believed he could be. Then Lauren's phone rang, slicing through the quiet. Lauren's expression shifted as she answered the call, hope giving way to alarm. Her knuckles whitened around the phone. Are you sure? She demanded. She ended the call and turned to Carson, urgency burning in her eyes. What is it? He asked. It's not just your personal assets, she said, voice tight with control. Canwell's made his move, against the company. The automated trading systems have been compromised. They're executing a coordinated sell-off. If it goes unchecked, it'll trigger a wave of margin calls. Carson's breath caught as the implications slammed into him. If successful, this attack wouldn't just crash Horizon Blake's stock. It could destabilize the market itself. How long do we have? Minutes, Lauren replied, already striding toward the elevator. The fail-safes have triggered, but someone needs to manually override the system at the main terminal. Diana and Judge Montgomery are unreachable. They're at the SEC finalizing the merger. The elevator doors opened. They stepped in together. I need access to the trading floor, Carson said, already running through emergency protocols in his mind. Lauren handed him her security badge. You'll have full access. But Carson, once this is over, no matter what happens. I know, he said softly. This doesn't change us. The elevator descended, carrying them toward the heart of the storm. There, Carson would face not just Canwell's sabotage, but the ultimate test of who he had become. Was his clarity real, or just another calculated maneuver? The doors slid open to chaos. Alarms blared. Traders shouted over each other. Screens flashed red. And then, silence. As Carson Blake stepped onto the floor, everything paused. Dozens of traders froze, stunned at the sight of the disgraced former CEO moving with urgent, purposeful intent. You can't be here, sir, a security officer called out, rushing forward. Carson held up Lauren's badge without slowing. Override authorization. We've got a level 1 breach. Across the room, terminals displayed waves of automated sell orders dumping Horizon Blake shares across platforms. The algorithms were reacting, escalating, amplifying. What the hell is going on? Demanded Sophia Chen, head trader, Carson's successor after the leadership change. Coordinated attack, Carson said, scanning the floor for the master terminal. Someone's hijacked the auto-trading system. We need to manually override before it cascades into a market-wide collapse. Sophia's eyes narrowed, her tone icy. And we're just supposed to trust you after everything? No, Lauren cut in, stepping beside Carson. You trust me, and right now Carson is the only one who knows how to stop this. The floor fell silent again, all eyes on them. Moving between Lauren and Carson, the traders on the floor had spent 15 years watching Carson's brilliance and his ruthlessness. They had also seen how he treated his wife, not as a partner, but as a background fixture, a polished accessory to parade at company galas. Now she stood not only as his equal, but possibly his superior. And she was vouching for him. In the heart of crisis, Sophia Chen hesitated just a beat, then nodded. The master terminals locked down in Protocol Room B. Only board-level credentials can trigger an override. My codes don't work anymore, Carson said, glancing to Lauren. She was already striding toward the secure room. I've got temporary override authority until the transition is finalized. As they moved swiftly across the floor, Carson's phone buzzed. A message? You can't stop this. 15 years too late. JC. James Canwell was watching, and he knew they were trying to fight back. How did they get into the system? Carson asked as Lauren pressed her palm to the biometric scanner. We think Celeste installed a backdoor during her tenure, Lauren said as the security door slid open. She had elevated permissions, thanks to your personal arrangement. The sting landed, but Carson let it pass. He deserved worse. Inside Protocol Room B, 3 large screens mapped the full scope of the assault. It wasn't just Carson Blake stock being sold off. The attackers had triggered a chain of cascading transactions, shorts, options, panic-inducing trades, all timed for maximum disruption. Carson slid into the main terminal chair. His fingers flew across the keys, assessing the breach. 15 years at the helm had hardwired him into every layer of the firm's infrastructure, including the buried emergency overrides. They've disabled standard override commands, he muttered, scanning lines of code. We need to access the kernel directly. Lauren leaned over his shoulder. Her presence, steady, confident, brought a strange calm. Can you do it? Yes, Carson said, his confidence real. But I'll need your full authentication set, all of it. Their eyes met. In that moment, the weight of the past hung between them. He was asking her to trust him again with everything. And without hesitation, Lauren took the keyboard and entered a series of intricate codes one after another, then slid it back to him. Thank you, Carson said softly. Just stop them, she replied, voice firm. Carson's focus narrowed to the screen. Everything else disappeared. This wasn't just a security breach. It was a war. He was locked in high-speed digital combat with Canwell's operatives, code for code, move for countermove, like blitz chess against a grandmaster, the stakes rising with every keystroke. Outside the sealed room, the floor continued to unravel. The market was reacting fast. Outside the glass walls, large monitors showed other stocks beginning to tumble in sympathy. CNBC anchors speculated live about a potential market correction triggered by instability at Carson Blake Financial. Inside, Carson worked with surgical precision, scanning deep into the firm's system architecture, searching for vulnerabilities he could flip to their advantage. There, he said suddenly, pointing to a subtle anomaly in the code. They're routing everything through an external command node. If I can isolate and cut that link. His fingers flew across the keyboard, executing what was essentially digital neurosurgery. One wrong keystroke could accelerate the collapse. Lauren stood silently beside him, watching with conflicted awe. This was the man she'd once loved, sharp, composed, fearless under pressure. He hadn't changed because he had to. He was remembering who he used to be. I've got it, Carson said after a long, tense silence. I can sever their access, but to stabilize the price, I'll need to execute a counter-trade. We'll have to liquidate long-term holdings. Do it, Lauren said without pause. Carson initiated the sequence, flooding the market with buy orders to counter the artificial pressure. The screen glowed as billions of dollars moved in real time, a jarring reminder of the sheer power he once commanded. Then his phone buzzed. A message from Canwell, impressive. But check your personal accounts. While you save the company, I'm taking everything else, JC. Carson handed the phone to Lauren, his expression grim. He's diverting us. This whole attack, it's just one piece of the strategy. Lauren was already dialing. Julian, they've started moving on Carson's private accounts. Can you block them? She listened for a moment, then nodded. Understood. Keep us updated. Fletcher's helping protect my assets? Carson asked, surprised. He has tools we need, Lauren replied, cool and focused, and he knows this isn't about old grudges anymore. On the screen, the market began to slow its descent. Carson's countermeasures were working. Sell-offs were easing, volume normalizing, but it wasn't over. They're adapting, he warned, watching code shift and reroute. They're coming through alternate servers now. Canwell's not giving up. Can you stop it? Not alone, Carson admitted. We need more power to close every back door simultaneously. Lauren dialed again. Camila, I need Fletcher Technologies' cybersecurity team patched into Protocol Room B, now. Within minutes, a secure video feed opened on the third screen. Julian Cross appeared, flanked by a team of cybersecurity specialists. Carson, Julian greeted, nodding curtly. Lauren's briefed us. My team is yours. Carson met his gaze, no pride, no pretense, just necessity. Thank you, he said sincerely. We'll need to coordinate a multi-pronged shutdown. Simultaneous closure across every access point. For the next 20 minutes, Carson worked side by side with Fletcher's team. His granular knowledge of the Blake Capital infrastructure melded seamlessly with their cutting-edge cybersecurity tactics. One by one, the breaches were neutralized, firewalls patched, systems hardened. Bit by bit, they closed in on Canwell's operation. As the immediate threat to the trading system began to recede, Carson shifted focus. They're bouncing the signals through multiple servers, he muttered, eyes locked on the console. But there's a pattern. It's all routing back through the Cayman Islands. Where Celeste was headed, Lauren noted quickly. It's too obvious, Carson said, frowning. Canwell wouldn't make that kind of mistake unless... He trailed off, the realization hitting hard. It's a diversion. He wants us tracking offshore, while the real breach is coming from somewhere else. Carson pulled up a network map showing Blake Capital's global server grid. His eyes landed on a data stream flowing through a lesser-used backup server, located right there in their own building. They're here, he said quietly. The backup server, 42nd floor. Lauren immediately called security. Send a team to the server room now. Carson opened the surveillance feed on his tablet, watching as guards converged on the floor. The room appeared untouched. Empty, Lauren said, frustration tightening her voice. If no one's physically there, how are they inside the system? Carson's expression darkened. They don't have to be there now. Not if the virus was planted earlier, cloaked to look like part of a firmware update. Someone with deep-level access, someone we trusted. Lauren's voice dropped. Celeste? No, Carson said, voice flat. Not Celeste. He pulled up the server room's access log, his fingers stilled. The last authorized entry? 12 hours ago. The name on the log, Nathan Pierce. Lauren stared at the screen, stunned. Nathan? He's been with the firm for 20 years. He was Richard's hire, not yours. Which made him the perfect mole, Carson said bitterly. No one would ever question Richard Blake's right hand. He typed furiously, locating the rogue device's IP. With one final command, he severed the connection. The screens flickered, then stabilized. Market activity returned to normal. The crisis was over. In the sudden stillness, Carson and Lauren exchanged a breath of relief. We need to find Nathan, Lauren said. He'll be long gone, Carson replied grimly. But if we act fast, we might be able to trace the funds. The door to Protocol Room B slid open. Nathan Pierce stood in the doorway, a 9mm pistol dangling at his side. His calm was chilling, like a man who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. I wouldn't bother, he said calmly. The money's already gone. Carson rose slowly, stepping protectively in front of Lauren. Why, Nathan? After everything we built? Built? Nathan laughed, low and bitter. You still believe that? That we were building something real? He stepped inside, the pistol loosely aimed at Carson. We built a monument to excess, a shrine to manipulation, packaged as innovation, and you never saw the hand guiding it all. Canwell, Carson said, understanding clicking into place. Nathan nodded. James recognized Richard's genius long before you even showed up. When you engineered that takeover, forced Richard out while he was dying, James swore he'd destroy you. But he needed someone inside. And you volunteered, Lauren said, her voice taut. Nathan's expression shifted, just for a moment. Something flickered. Regret? Guilt? It passed too quickly to name. softening. As Nathan looked at her, his voice softened. I'm truly sorry, Lauren. You were never supposed to be collateral damage. I actually tried to protect you. By helping dismantle my father's legacy, she snapped. By making sure there was something left when Carson finally imploded? I was preserving what I could, Nathan replied calmly, which he finally has. Carson's mind raced, calculating variables, angles, risks. Nathan had always been methodical, never rash. The fact that he'd shown his hand now, armed and exposed, meant this was the endgame. The moment he'd prepared for all along. So what now? Carson asked, subtly shifting his weight to keep balance. You shoot us both and vanish with the money? That feels messy, not your style. Nothing so theatrical, Nathan said with a dry smile. The weapon is just insurance, to make sure you don't interfere. In about 3 minutes, the last of your personal assets will be transferred to accounts you'll never trace. He glanced at his watch. Once that's done, I disappear. Cameras in this section are disabled. I have a clean exit. What Nathan didn't realize was that during their exchange, Carson had been quietly typing behind his back, triggering an emergency protocol embedded in the system years ago. A hidden contingency Lauren had never even known about. I underestimated you, Carson said, buying time as the protocol activated. All these years I thought you were just conservative. Turns out you were playing the long game. That was always your weakness, Nathan replied. You couldn't see past the next deal. The next quarter, you built wealth, but never legacy. Legacy like yours? Carson challenged. You and Canwell, stealing back stolen money? That makes you what, righteous thieves? Nathan's face darkened. We're restoring what was taken. Richard Blake's ideas, his ethics, his relationships. You hollowed them out and made it a money-making engine. Now that machine is breaking, piece by piece. Behind them, a soft chime sounded from the terminal. Nathan's eyes flicked toward it. What did you do? He snapped, raising the weapon. Something you taught me, Carson said calmly. Always have a backup plan. On the main screen, a window opened, unveiling a web of hidden transactions. Nathan's personal financial empire. Exposed. Frozen. Dead man's switch, Carson explained. If I was ever held at gunpoint in this room, the system would scan, isolate, and lock every account linked to the threat. Every shell company, every offshore trust, flagged for investigation. Paranoid? Maybe, but turns out, justified. Nathan's face turned pale as his carefully orchestrated escape crumbled on screen. You can still shoot us, Carson acknowledged, but the money's already gone. Every dollar. Already locked, already reported. For a moment, time stopped. 3 people. 1 room. A triangle of betrayal and truth. Then Nathan lowered the gun. His shoulders slumped, defeated. 15 years, he said quietly. 15 years watching you dismantle everything Richard built. Watching you trade principles for profit. Watching you treat Lauren like a prop in your empire. He turned toward Lauren, his voice softer. He doesn't deserve your help, or your loyalty. This isn't about what Carson deserves, Lauren replied steadily. It's about protecting what matters. The company, its employees, its clients. What my father understood, even if Carson forgot it. Security burst through the door, alerted by the emergency protocol Carson had triggered earlier. As they restrained Nathan and let him out, he looked back one last time. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with conviction. You haven't won, he said with chilling calm. You've lost everything that ever mattered. And then he was gone. Carson and Lauren stood in the silence that followed, surrounded by the echo of averted catastrophe. Beyond the glass, the trading floor had stabilized. The market was recovering. The threat had passed. But between them, nothing was resolved. Thank you, Lauren said at last, her voice steady, for stopping them. Thank you, Carson replied, for trusting me to try, after everything. Their eyes met. In that look, an entire history passed between them. Shared victories, deeper betrayals, and a love long eclipsed by ambition. A moment suspended by years, 15 of them. Of partnership, of distance, of betrayal, and unspoken truths. This doesn't change anything, Lauren said quietly, echoing his own words from earlier. I know, Carson said, finally understanding the full measure of what he'd lost. He had saved the company, but he had lost his wife, his oldest friend, and any illusion that his empire had ever been built on anything but vanity. As they stepped out of Protocol Room B, a strange clarity washed over him. For the first time in 15 years, Carson Blake didn't see himself as the master of the West Coast financial world. He saw a man who had traded everything of true value for the hollow shine of wealth. "What will you do now?" Lauren asked as they entered the elevator. "Honor our agreement," Carson said. "Step away from the company. Work with the Ethics Foundation, if you'll still have me." He hesitated. "Not to fix us, I know that's gone, but maybe to become the man your father once thought I could be." The elevator descended in silence, away from the crisis, toward a future they would face, separately. When the doors opened into the lobby, Julian Cross was waiting. He took in the sight of Carson and Lauren emerging together, unreadable. "It's over," Lauren said. "Nathan was the mole. He's been working with Canwell from the beginning." Julian nodded slowly. His gaze turned to Carson. "You saved a lot of people today." "Too little too late," Carson muttered. The bitterness in his voice was met himself. "Perhaps," Julian said, "or perhaps just in time." Before Carson could respond, Diana Hamid strode through the main entrance, flanked by Judge Montgomery and a squadron of lawyers. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. "You knew," Carson said, turning to Lauren. "You expected Canwell to make a move." "Today was the day," Lauren confirmed. "We suspected as much." The SEC filing to finalize the merger must have been the trigger. Canwell was waiting for one last shot before the new protocols locked him out. Diana approached, her sharp gaze quickly assessing the scene. "I see we missed the fireworks." "The crisis is over," Lauren said. "Thanks to Carson." The acknowledgement caught Diana off guard. He identified Nathan Pierce as Canwell's operative and stopped the breach. Diana studied Carson anew. Did he now? How? Unexpectedly heroic. "Not heroic," Carson said. "Just necessary. I helped create this vulnerability by trusting the wrong people, by chasing growth over governance. The least I could do was help fix it." The quiet honesty in his voice struck deeper than any justification could have. Diana exchanged a brief glance with Judge Montgomery before turning back to him. "Well, Mr. Blake," she said, "we may need to revisit some aspects of our arrangement." Carson shook his head. "No need. I'll honor the terms. The company's better in new hands." "Even if those new hands," Diana added with a sly tone, "might benefit from your expertise. Not as CEO, of course, but perhaps in a more active advisory role. Something deeper than we initially discussed." Carson looked to Lauren. This was her moment. Her win. He wouldn't accept anything that undermined that. "That's her call," he said simply. "It's her foundation, her vision." The lobby grew quiet. All eyes turned to Lauren. Straight-backed, composed, every inch Richard Blake's daughter. "I'll consider it," she said after a beat. "But not today. Today's been full enough." As the group slowly dispersed, each tending to the legal and operational fallout, Carson found himself standing alone in the lobby of the building that had once defined his empire. Through the glass, Los Angeles stretched wide before him. Same city, same skyline, but transformed because he was different. His phone buzzed, a message from a name that still made his chest tighten. "My office, tomorrow, 9 a.m. We have unfinished business. L." He stared at the screen. Reckoning? Closure? A second chance? He couldn't say. But one thing was clear. The man who would walk into her office tomorrow was not the same one who had taken everything for granted just days ago. The price of his ambition had been almost everything. What remained to be seen was whether there was anything left worth rebuilding. At precisely 9 the next morning, Carson arrived. The offices of the Blake Ethics Foundation occupied the 38th floor of a pristine tower overlooking downtown Los Angeles, an address he had funded long ago as a tax maneuver, never once bothering to visit. "Mr. Blake," Camila Rivera greeted him from behind a clean-lined reception desk. "Mrs. Blake is expecting you." Mrs. Blake. The words landed unexpectedly heavy. They were still legally married. Bound by a contract neither had yet moved to dissolve. Camila guided him through an open-concept workspace where young professionals were already deep in early projects. They glanced up as Carson passed. Their expressions, curiosity, caution, and in more than one case, quiet resentment. His reputation clearly preceded him. Lauren's office was a stark contrast to Carson's old corner suite at Blake Capital, where his had exuded intimidation. Dark wood, leather chairs, sweeping views. Hers was designed to encourage dialogue. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the space in natural light, highlighting walls adorned with artwork by LA-based artists instead of accolades and deal trophies. She stood as he entered, composed, poised. The quiet strength Carson had overlooked for far too long. "Thank you for coming," she said, motioning toward a set of armchairs instead of taking position behind her desk. Carson sat, noting the absence of power plays. No performance, no posturing, just presence. The subtle dominance he'd engineered into every corner of his old world was nowhere to be found here. "I wasn't sure what this meeting was about," he admitted. "Several things," Lauren replied, taking the seat across from him. "First, an update. Nathan's cooperating with federal investigators. He's provided evidence that James Canwell orchestrated the entire scheme, including planting Celeste inside the company. And Celeste? Still in the Caymans, but her accounts are frozen. It's just a matter of time before she's extradited." Carson nodded, absorbing the facts without expression. "And the company?" he asked. "Stabilized. The markets have recovered. Diana's been excellent with the major clients." She paused. "Your counterattack was pivotal. Without you, the fallout would have been catastrophic." "It was the least I could do," Carson said quietly, "considering I helped create the opening." Lauren studied him for a long moment. Her gaze was clear, thoughtful. "That's exactly what I wanted to talk about," she said. "Your role, both in what happened and in what comes next." She stood and moved to the sideboard, pouring 2 glasses of water. As she returned, Carson's eyes caught on an item atop her desk. Richard Blake's pocket watch. The same one Carson had tucked away after Richard's death, out of sight and out of mind. Now it sat center stage. A symbol of time, lost, reclaimed, and reckoned with. "Diana and Judge Montgomery have suggested revising the agreement," Lauren continued, handing him a glass. "They think your insight could be valuable during the transition, especially after yesterday." "And you?" Carson asked. "What do you believe?" Lauren sat down again, thoughtful. "I think you're at a crossroads, Carson. For 15 years, you've measured yourself by what you could acquire, control, dominate." She leaned in. "Now that's gone. The question is, who are you without all that? Without the title, the empire, the image?" Her eyes didn't waver. "Is there still a man behind the machine, or just the echoes of ambition? Is there still something left of the man my father believed in, the man I once chose?" The question landed like a strike, precise, impossible to dodge. Carson didn't flinch. He'd asked himself that same question in the still hours of the night. "I don't know," he said finally. "For so long, my worth was tied to the size of the deals I closed, the company's growth, the headlines, the rivals I beat. Without that," Carson said slowly, "I'm not sure what's left." "Then maybe," Lauren said gently, "that's what you need to find out, before either of us makes any decisions about the future." "What are you proposing?" "A sabbatical," she said. 3 months, away from LA, away from finance, away from the version of Carson Blake you've spent your whole life building." She handed him a folder that had been sitting on the coffee table between them. "There's a property up north. It belonged to my father, a cabin near Lake Superior. Simple, isolated, but comfortable." Carson opened the folder. Inside were photographs of a small, sturdy cabin overlooking the endless expanse of water. Quiet, still, a world away from anything he would have chosen. "To do what?" he asked, honestly unsure. "To figure out who Carson Blake is, without the power, the title, the deal flow," Lauren said. "To face the parts of you that got lost in the pursuit of everything else." He closed the folder slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. "And after 3 months? If you decide to return," she said, "Diana and Judge Montgomery are open to a consulting role. There'd be strict oversight. Boundaries." She paused. "The Ethics Foundation would also welcome your input if your perspectives evolved. Not as a way back in," she added, "but maybe as a way forward." Carson looked up, finally voicing the question that had lingered unspoken. "And us?" Lauren's expression shifted, softer now, layered with memory and restraint. "I don't know, Carson. 15 years can't be undone by a crisis. Not the damage, not the distance." She exhaled slowly. "But I do know I can't make a decision about us until I see who you're becoming, and until you understand that too." Carson nodded, a strange calm settling in. "When would I leave?" "Today, if possible. The cabin's ready, and you're staying here right now complicates things for everyone." "And you?" he asked. "What will you be doing while I'm figuring out my existence next to a lake?" Running the foundation, she said. Helping rebuild Carson Blake's reputation. Living my life. She smiled faintly. Getting reacquainted with the woman I was before I became Mrs. Carson Blake. The version of me who didn't settle for being someone else's silent strength. Carson stood, folder in hand. I'll go, not because I think it'll fix our marriage or my career, but because you're right. I need to know who I am without either. His voice wavered for the first time, not with uncertainty, but with the weight of acknowledgement. As he turned to leave, Lauren called out softly. Carson, there's one more thing. He paused. She held out a small worn journal bound in faded leather. Richard Blake's, the one Carson had kept for years, unread. Take this with you, she said. My father saw something in you once, something worth believing in. Maybe his words can help you find that part again. Or remind you that it ever existed in the first place. Carson took the journal. Their fingers brushed. Thank you. 3 months, Lauren said. No contact. No calls. No markets. Just you, the lake, and whatever you find in yourself. And then, he asked. And then, she said softly, we'll see. As Carson stepped out of the Foundation's offices, downtown LA pulsed with its usual rhythm, dealmakers and dreamers racing through the day. The financial world kept turning. But for the first time in 15 years, Carson Blake wasn't running alongside it. He was finally stepping off the wheel, to discover if there was still a life waiting to be built. This had once been his domain, his arena, the space in which Carson Blake had thrived, the terrain he had conquered. Now he watched it all from a distance, detached from its rhythms and ambitions. His phone buzzed, notifications, news alerts, texts, stock updates about Blake Capital's rebound, headlines on Nathan Pierce's arrest, speculation about his future. With a single motion, Carson silenced it all. He powered the device down and let go, like closing a chapter, not with fury, but with finality. 3 hours later, he stood in the foyer of the penthouse he had once acquired as a trophy, a monument to a life built on image. The luggage by the door contained casual clothes he rarely wore. Everything else he had delegated to his legal team. Financial matters, personal affairs, a pause button on a life in freefall. The rest, his titles, his illusions, he was leaving behind. As he turned to leave, the elevator opened and Julian Cross stepped out. Heading somewhere? Julian asked, taking in the suitcases. Northern Michigan, Carson replied. Lauren's idea. Julian nodded knowingly. The cabin on Lake Superior. Carson narrowed his eyes. You've been there? Once. Years ago, Julian said. Richard took me when I was just starting Fletcher Technologies, said it was the place he went when he needed to remember what mattered, where clarity found him before ambition buried it again. He walked over, posture easy but deliberate. I won't stay long, he said, holding out a sealed envelope. Financial intel. My team's analysis of Canwell's entire operation. Figured you should know what you were up against. Carson accepted the envelope with a hint of wariness. Why now? I'm walking away. Because Richard believed in you, Julian said simply, and despite everything, I respected him. Consider it perspective for whatever you're about to learn up there. Sometimes the truth isn't for the man you were, he added, but for the one you still have a chance to become. As the elevator closed behind him, Carson stared at the envelope, then tucked it, unopened, beside Richard's journal in his briefcase. He'd read both. But not here. Not yet. The drive north took 6 hours. L.A. Its endless sprawl gave way to the calm of Central California, then pine-dense roads twisting along the shoreline. With every mile, Carson shed another layer. Executive. Architect of empire. Betrayed husband. Public villain. Each identity peeled away like old skin. Each mile, a quiet reckoning. By the time he turned off the main road, bumping down a narrow dirt path, he no longer knew what role remained. The cabin was as Lauren had described. Quiet, weathered, perched above the endless shimmer of Lake Superior. Inside it was modest, worn leather chairs, bookshelves lined with novels and field guides, a fireplace stacked with wood. No screens, no art, no noise, no version of Carson Blake staring back from the walls, just space. A single sheet of paper waited on the kitchen table. Juliet's handwriting. Pantries stocked, firewoods outside. No internet. Nearest town's 20 miles south. Cell service is unreliable. Time moves differently here. Let it. Carson placed the note back on the table, then walked out to the porch. The late sun spilled fire across the water. Crimson streaks danced over endless blue. It felt like standing at the edge of the world, and maybe that's exactly where he needed to be. And for the first time in years, perhaps ever, Carson Blake had nowhere to be. No one to outwit, nothing to prove. He sat down facing the lake and waited for silence to teach him what success never had. That night, the silence pressed in. After building a fire in the stone hearth, Carson finally opened the envelope Julian Cross had given him. Inside was a dossier, an exposé of James Canwell's 15-year vendetta. But more than that, it was a mirror. Page after page detailed Carson's own complicity, not in crime, but in character. Arrogance, ruthlessness, the systematic erasure of relationships once they'd outlived their utility. Victor's betrayal, Celeste's infiltration. The SEC's scrutiny. They weren't random, they were consequences, echoes of seeds Carson himself had planted long ago. One document made him freeze, a psychological profile. Canwell had commissioned it in the early days of his campaign. It described Carson as pathologically driven by external validation, emotionally detached, vulnerable to manipulation through his own sense of superiority. He read the lines again and again. Each time, the words burrowed deeper. This wasn't just a summary of his professional persona. It was a dissection of his self. The habits of mind, the blind spots, the compulsions that had brought him wealth and ruin. Carson set the papers down, then reached for Richard Blake's journal. He flipped to a random entry, dated 17 years earlier. Had dinner with Carson Blake tonight. Brilliant young man. Extraordinary mind for markets. But I worry about the hunger. He sees the chessboard but not the players. I remember that ambition before Catherine and Lauren taught me what really matters. Maybe mentoring him will give him what I never had. There's goodness in him. I saw it when he talked about building something enduring. The question is whether that goodness will survive his ascent or be sacrificed to it. Carson closed the journal. A tightness spread through his chest. Grief, guilt, maybe even gratitude. Richard had seen him, all of him, and still believed. The days that followed unfolded with monastic simplicity. Mornings, coffee on the porch, watching the lake shift with light and wind. Afternoons, chopping wood, patching the roof, hiking nearby trails. Evenings, reading the journal from beginning to end, watching the arc of Richard Blake's hopes, worries, and fading strength unfold in ink. A week into the exile, Carson drove south to the small town of Whitefish Bay for supplies. The general store's bell jingled overhead as he entered. The elderly clerk greeted him with an easy smile. "You up at the Blake place?" the man asked. Carson nodded, trying to clear my head. "Another city guy come to find himself," the man chuckled. "Richard used to stop in all the time. Good man, asked about my granddaughter's college plans every visit, always remembered, even after she graduated." "You knew him well?" Carson asked. "Well enough to know he loved that cabin," the man said. Said it reminded him of who he was before the markets got loud. Carson smiled faintly. For the first time, he understood exactly what Richard meant. The owner gave a light chuckle as he bagged Carson's groceries. Said it reminded him what the money was for. Never did quite understand that myself. Never had enough to forget. Carson pondered that on the long drive back. What the money was for. Had he ever asked himself that question? Or had wealth and power become the goal, an end in itself, detached from meaning? 2 weeks into his sabbatical, Carson received his first and only visitor. He was out back, splitting firewood, when a rental car crunched its way down the dirt road. From it stepped Judge Montgomery, looking surprisingly at ease in hiking boots and a windbreaker. "Productive therapy," Montgomery said, nodding toward the neat pile of split logs. Richard swore by it. Carson set the axe down and wiped his brow. "Didn't expect visitors." "Lauren doesn't know I'm here," Montgomery assured him. "This is just between us." Carson gestured toward the porch, where 2 Adirondack chairs faced the water. They settled in. Montgomery pulled a small flask from his jacket. 15-year-old Scotch, he said, offering it. Felt appropriate. Carson took a measured sip and passed it back. "So," he asked, "why are you here?" The judge was quiet for a moment, watching the lake. "I've known 3 generations of Blakes," he said. "Watched them build, lose, rebuild. I've seen wealth bring out the best in people, and the worst." He turned to Carson. "I wanted to see if there's anything left of the young man Richard believed in, the one he hoped would love his daughter and honor his legacy." Carson met his gaze. "And what's your verdict?" Still deliberating, Montgomery said with a small smile. But I'm encouraged you've lasted 2 weeks without fleeing back to the city. He chuckled. Richard only made it 3 days the first time. They sat in silence for a while, watching an osprey dive into the lake, wings slicing cleanly into the water. Did you know? Carson asked eventually. About Nathan working with Canwell? Montgomery exhaled slowly. I suspected someone close to you was leaking information, but no, I didn't know it was Nathan until recently. That's the thing about long games, Carson said. You think you're the one moving the pieces, but you're just another piece being moved. Montgomery gave him a long, thoughtful look. That realization, he said, that we're all both players and played, that's the beginning of wisdom, Carson. He sipped the scotch, then added, the question is, what do you do with it? Carson looked away. And what would your wisdom suggest? Montgomery smiled. Keep chopping wood, he said. Keep reading Richard's journal. Keep sitting with the truth that the empire you built rested on a foundation laid by others, some of whom you never fully acknowledged. He stood, but before leaving he paused beside Carson's chair. For what it's worth, he said softly, I think Richard would be glad to see you here. Carson looked up sharply. Why? He believed in redemption more than punishment, Montgomery replied. That's why he made sure this place would come back to you. Carson blinked. What do you mean? The cabin, Montgomery said. Richard left it to Lauren. But with instructions, if you ever came to a place of real reckoning, real change, she was to pass it on to you. He called it his investment in your humanity, Montgomery had said before leaving. The one asset he believed would yield returns after every other had been exhausted. Carson sat in stillness long after the judge departed. This wasn't just property he had inherited. It was faith, a belief in the man he could become, held by someone who had seen his worst and still chosen to hope. In the weeks that followed, Carson returned to Richard's journal, reading with new eyes, finding entries he'd overlooked in the beginning. One passage, written during Richard's final months, struck him hardest. Carson believes my illness clouds my judgment on the Anderson deal. Perhaps it does, but not in the way he thinks. Facing mortality clarifies priorities with brutal efficiency. I can no longer justify sacrificing what matters for marginal financial gain. He sees my insistence on preserving jobs as sentimentality. He cannot yet grasp that the balance sheet of a life well lived includes assets that never appear in quarterly reports. I pray before it's too late, he'll learn what took me too long to see. Success without integrity is merely achievement. And achievement without purpose is hollow. The words carved deep. They forced Carson to reckon, not just with what he had done, but who he had become. In silence, away from the noise and applause, he began to unravel it all. Not just the recent decisions that led to his downfall, but the pattern, the consistent prioritization of growth over gratitude, metrics over meaning, acquisition over acknowledgement. Midway through his second month, Carson added a nightly ritual, writing letters, not to be sent. Letters to Richard, apologizing for perverting his vision. To Nathan, acknowledging the legitimacy beneath his betrayal. To Celeste, owning the environment of manipulation he had enabled. And most painfully, to Lauren. I failed to see you, he wrote, not just as my wife, but as a whole person, with brilliance, purpose, and agency. I reduced you to a role in my narrative, instead of honoring you as the protagonist of your own. Perhaps that is my gravest failure, not recognizing the full humanity in the person closest to me. As the third month began, something shifted, not a dramatic rebirth, but a quiet loosening of the grip that ego had held on him for years. The silence was no longer suffocating, it was cleansing. The simplicity wasn't a deprivation, it was clarity. One morning, as the lake shimmered in soft tones of pearl and silver, Carson made a decision. He wouldn't return to Los Angeles, not yet. The reckoning wasn't complete, and he wasn't ready to re-enter the world he'd once ruled. He drove to Whitefish Bay and used the general store's landline, the only reliable connection. The line rang. Then, her voice. It hit him harder than expected. It's me, he said, a pause. I wanted to let you know, I won't be coming back next week. I see, Lauren replied. Is the isolation too much? The opposite, Carson said softly. It's not enough. I need more time, Lauren, Carson said softly, to understand who I am, beyond the man I've pretended to be for so long. How much more time? She asked. I don't know, he admitted. But I wanted to honor our agreement, to tell you instead of just disappearing. A pause, longer this time. Thank you, she said. Are you finding what you needed there? Carson considered. Not yet, but I'm finding the courage to look, honestly, and that feels like a beginning. It does. Lauren said quietly. It really does. 3 days before he was originally supposed to return, a package arrived, delivered by a local courier. Inside was a legal document, the cabin's deed, and a handwritten note. Fulfilling my father's wishes. This place is yours now, for as long as you need it. I've extended your consulting consideration with Diana and Judge Montgomery indefinitely. Take the time you need, Carson. The person you're becoming deserves that space. L. Tucked behind the deed was a photograph he had never seen before. Richard Blake and a much younger Carson, seated on the porch of this very cabin, both mid-laugh, eyes lit by something long lost to time. On the back, Lauren had written, "He believed this man still exists. Maybe he was right." On what would have been his last day at the cabin, Carson sat on the porch. A storm loomed over Lake Superior, dark clouds tumbling in from the horizon. The wind picked up, setting the water into restless movement, not the chaotic force of ambition, something deeper, elemental, cleansing. His phone, untouched for 3 months, sat beside him. That morning he'd charged it, not from urgency, just curiosity. Now he switched it on. The screen lit up, hundreds of missed calls, unread emails, news alerts. Carson scrolled through them, calmly. No panic, no need to respond. Headlines caught his eye. Blake Capital rebrands under new leadership. Nathan Pierce pleads guilty in federal fraud case. Celeste Blake arrested in the Caymans. Fletcher Technologies partners with Hamid Blake Ethics Foundation. One headline made him pause. Lauren Blake named CEO of Foundation, announces expansion. He clicked. The article showed her at a podium, confident, composed, visionary. The piece described her mission, to evolve the foundation into a real engine for ethical change in finance, not just a line-item tax shelter. Carson set the phone down. He felt no jealousy, no bitterness, only pride. A quiet, reverent kind of pride, for the woman he had finally learned to see. As the first rain hit the porch roof, Carson made his decision. He would stay through winter, experience the cabin as Richard had, in every season, and in the spring he would return, not to reclaim power, not to rebuild an empire, but to serve, to offer whatever knowledge remained useful to Lauren's vision. Whether their relationship could ever be mended was a question only time could answer. But this time, he would not return for redemption. He would return for purpose. Some betrayals cut too deep for simple healing, and Carson Blake had no illusions about the damage he had caused. But for the first time in his adult life, rebuilding his marriage wasn't a goal to be achieved, a tactical victory, or an extension of control. It was hope, pure, uncertain, and born of genuine remorse. That night, as wind whipped through the pines and rain lashed against the cabin windows, Carson wrote one final letter. Unlike the others, this one would be sent. Lauren, for 3 months I've lived in your father's sanctuary, confronting truths I spent decades avoiding. The man who arrived here measured worth in control, ownership, and victory. The man writing this knows how hollow those measures truly are. I won't be returning to LA. Not yet. There is still work to do. Not on the cabin, but on the person inside it. When I do come back, it won't be to reclaim anything, only to offer what I might still become, if that self proves worthy. I don't know if there's a path forward for us. Some damage can't be undone, only acknowledged. But I want you to know, I see you now. Your strength, your vision, your integrity, the same qualities your father saw, and the ones I was too blind, too arrogant to appreciate. The deed arrived. Please thank Judge Montgomery for his visit and his grace. I understand now why this place mattered to Richard, and why he wanted me to find it, eventually. With respect and regret, Carson P.S. Enclosed is something I should have given you years ago. The first page of your father's journal. It belongs to you more than to me. Attached to the letter was a fragile page, carefully removed, dated after Richard Blake's diagnosis. The doctors say I have months, not years. The news should devastate me, but instead, I feel clarity. When time becomes finite, what matters comes into focus. Lauren is my greatest achievement. Not this company, not the accolades, not the money. In her I see the balance I always wanted for myself. Fierce and kind, driven and generous. My greatest fear isn't death, It's leaving her vulnerable to people who see her worth only superficially. Carson sees her beauty, but not yet her brilliance. He covets her. He doesn't cherish her. I can only hope time and love will teach him what took me a lifetime to understand. That real wealth lies not in what we possess, but in what we protect. If you're reading this, Carson, know this. I entrusted my greatest treasures to you, my daughter and my legacy. How you honor them will define not just your success, but your humanity. As Carson sealed the letter, thunder cracked over Lake Superior. Nature's punctuation to the close of one chapter and the fragile start of another. Outside, the lake raged. Inside, in the stillness of the cabin Richard Blake had loved, Carson Blake faced the storm within himself with humility and respect. The empire he once ruled was gone, but from its ruins something quieter and truer might rise. Not a monument to ambition, but a testament to redemption. 18 months later, snow drifted past the tall windows of the Hamid Blake Ethics Foundation, coating downtown Los Angeles in a pristine hush. It softened the sharp corners of a city built on competition and conquest. And inside, something new was being built, something meant to last. From the 38th floor, the view was ethereal. Skyscrapers shimmered like glass spires in a fairy tale. Lake Michigan, frozen and gleaming, stretched toward the horizon in shades of pewter and pearl. Carson Blake stood by the window, watching snow accumulate along the ledge. At 49, he looked markedly different from the man who had once ruled Blake Capital. The expensive suits remained, but the edge, the hunger, the posturing had quieted. His hair now carried streaks of silver, and the lines around his eyes spoke not of scheming, but of reckoning. The board approved all 3 proposals, Lauren said, entering her office with a stack of folders in hand. Even Henderson voted yes, which I didn't expect. Carson turned from the window, offering a genuine smile. Henderson respects data. The pilot results were too good to ignore. Your presentation helped, Lauren said, setting the folders down. You've always known how to speak their language. I've had excellent coaching, Carson replied, his eyes meeting hers. There was gratitude there, quiet, sincere. Their professional relationship had evolved over the past year. After 8 months in isolation, Carson had returned to Los Angeles, not to reclaim anything, but to offer what he had left, on Lauren's terms. His insider knowledge, once used to bend systems, now fueled reforms to prevent those same abuses. It was a strange symmetry, justice maybe, poetic or otherwise. Their personal lives remained undefined. The divorce papers, once drafted in anger and grief, remained unsigned. Neither had moved to finalize them. Neither had torn them up. Instead, they existed in something new, a careful balance, professional respect, emotional ambiguity, tentative rediscovery. Diana called, Lauren said, taking her seat. The ethics certification program's being adopted by 3 more major banks. She smiled faintly. Apparently your reputation for knowing where the bodies are buried makes compliance officers very attentive during their trainings. Carson chuckled. Poetic justice. Lauren raised an eyebrow. Using your former tactics to close the loopholes you once exploited? Exactly. A knock interrupted them. Camila entered with 2 coffees. Your fora was canceled due to the weather, she said. Mr. Fletcher confirmed dinner at 7, weather permitting. Thanks, Camila, Lauren replied. As Camila exited, Carson arched a brow. Fletcher still making his case? Lauren met his gaze, calm and steady. Julian's been a good friend and a strong supporter of the foundation. Tonight's dinner is strategy for next month's congressional testimony. Of course, Carson nodded. He asked no more. Whatever lay between Lauren and Julian remained theirs to define, one of many boundaries Carson had learned to respect. Lauren studied him for a moment. The cabin looks good with the renovations, she said. When I dropped those documents last month, I barely recognized it. Just some updates, Carson replied. Nothing major. The original character is still intact. She smiled, then returned to her folders, and he stood by the window a moment longer. The city shimmered in the snow, restless, brilliant, alive. I've come to appreciate Richard's vision for the place, Carson said quietly. He would be pleased, Lauren replied, her voice soft, with the cabin, and with everything else. Carson nodded, understanding the weight of her words. There was a time when Richard Blake's approval had felt like a constraint, something to push against, outgrow, outpace. Now, The possibility that he might finally be honoring the man's legacy carried a meaning Carson hadn't known he was missing. "I'm heading back tomorrow," he said. "The quarterly review is done. The certification materials are all in place." "For the weekend?" "Maybe longer," Lauren nodded. "Winter on Superior has its own kind of beauty," she said. "Stark, honest, like the man who lives there now." Carson smiled, humbled. "Still working on that. Some renovations take longer than others." The intercom buzzed. "Mrs. Blake, Judge Montgomery is here." "Send him in," Lauren replied. The door opened to reveal Harold Montgomery, still vigorous at 78, his sharp eyes scanning the room like a man decades younger. Now chairman of the Foundation's board, he carried both gravitas and a quiet mischief. "Carson," he greeted warmly, "good to see you." "Judge," Carson replied, shaking his hand, "your insights made all the difference in the certification design." Montgomery waved a hand, settling into a chair. "I've just come from a rather fascinating lunch with our old friend Nathan Pierce." Carson blinked. "Nathan's out?" "Released last week," Montgomery said. "Reduced sentence for full cooperation." Lauren and Carson exchanged a glance. "He asked to see me specifically," Montgomery continued, "to make amends, in his way. He gave me something. Said it was meant for you." He handed Carson a sealed envelope. Carson turned it over in his hands, brow furrowing. "He said it was something he should have delivered 15 years ago, when Richard first got sick." Carson opened it carefully. Inside, a letter, handwritten, dated just weeks before Richard Blake's death. As he read, Carson's posture shifted, from curiosity to disbelief to something close to awe. "What is it?" Lauren asked gently. Carson looked up. His voice was low. "Your father never intended for me to take over alone." He passed the letter to her. "He wanted me as his successor, but with you as an equal partner. His plan was always for the two of us, together, innovation and ethics, drive and direction." Lauren read the letter. Her hands trembled slightly. "Victor kept this from us," she said at last, eyes shining. Carson nodded. "He was supposed to deliver it if Richard's treatment failed, but he didn't. He decided you weren't ready," Montgomery added gently, "that you'd see Richard's idea of shared leadership as weakness." "He was right," Carson admitted. "Back then, I would have rejected it. I would have seen it as doubt, not wisdom." The three sat in silence. Not grief, not outrage, just the quiet weight of what might have been. "The question," Judge Montgomery said finally, rising to leave, "is not what might have been, but what still could be." He crossed to the door, pausing briefly. "I'll leave you two to discuss that. Snow's getting heavier, and my driver gets nervous when the streets turn poetic." After the door shut behind him, Lauren and Carson stood by the tall windows, watching the snow transform the city into something softer, more forgiving. "Your father saw everything clearly," Carson said quietly. "What I could be at my best, and who I might become at my worst." "He also saw me," Lauren replied, "not just as his daughter, but as a counterbalance to your ambition." "A partnership," Carson said, turning fully toward her, "that neither of us was ready to understand." "And now?" she asked. "We've both changed," Lauren said. "I found strength I didn't know I had. And you," she looked at him, "you found humility you never thought you needed." She held up the letter. "Maybe that's why Nathan chose to share this now, not to rewrite the past, but to hint at a future." Carson met her gaze. "What kind of future do you see?" Her pause was thoughtful, deliberate. "One where we honor what your ambition built, and what my principles protected, where neither of us stands in the other's shadow." Carson nodded slowly. "Equal partners. In whatever capacity we decide," Lauren added, leaving the door open but unforced. "Undefined. Real." As evening fell, they worked side by side, occasional conversation, comfortable silence. Not the driven rhythm of former power plays, something simpler. Mutual respect, hard-won, unexpected. When Lauren finally gathered her things for dinner with Julian, she paused at the door. "Let me know when you're back from the cabin." "Of course," Carson said. Then gently, "And Lauren, thank you." "For what?" "For seeing what might still be salvaged, when all I could see was what was lost." After she left, Carson remained at the window. Outside, the city fell under snow, each flake erasing sharp edges. The skyline was still there, but it looked different now, like him, recognizable, but altered. On his desk sat the unsigned divorce papers, untouched for nearly 2 years. Beside them, Richard's letter. A vision of partnership buried too long, its timing lost, its potential rediscovered. Carson shrugged into his coat and gathered his briefcase. Tomorrow, he would return to the cabin on Lake Superior, Richard's cabin, now his, to face another winter, to keep learning. And when spring came, maybe something else would emerge, not just from the melting snow, but between two people who had lost and found themselves in the ruins of ambition. Outside, Los Angeles carried on beneath the snowfall, oblivious to reckonings of the heart. And in that indifference lay the clearest truth. True worth was never in what we built, but in how we endured, and who we became when it all came crashing down. Dear friend, hey, if you're still here with me, thank you. Stories like Carson's aren't just fiction. They reflect parts of our own lives, don't they? That moment when everything you thought defined you suddenly falls apart. When the titles, the successes, the applause, all go quiet, and you're left asking, who am I really? Carson's story reminds us that sometimes the fall is where the real journey begins. The Stoics taught us that we don't control what happens, only how we choose to face it. And that's powerful. Because even in the wreckage, there's room to rebuild. Not the old version of yourself, but someone wiser, more grounded, more you. So if you've ever felt like you were starting over, or like everything was slipping through your fingers, please know, you're not alone. And maybe, just maybe, this is where something better begins. Because true value isn't in what we build, it's in who we become when the building breaks down. If this story moved you, I'd be so grateful if you'd like the video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to the channel. There's more to come, and I'd love for you to be here for it.